Now, what one needs to do as far as understanding what's happening within the company with regard to those factors pointed out is to get into a gap analysis. Now, that would possibly come, as I mentioned, from what the company needs to achieve at all. So it should not be prescriptive. Rather, it should take into account what the goals and ambition of the company is, and from there derive what needs to be done, as we've seen earlier in this, what the vision, mission, and how the involvement, empowerment, consultation should flow on. Now, how does one get to know what the planning and etc., and how whether the company is involving people or whether there's enough consultation in place? Well, this methodology suggests that you listen to the people and not simply look at the documents or, for that matter, things in the file or which have been sent as emailers. Not only listen to the people at all levels need to be listened to. Unfortunately, this is not a practice which is effected at every organization. People hear the people of a certain standing. So it's either the top managers or line managers who've given a patient hearing, but the frontliners aren't. Also, one needs to understand that in an environment, people would not be speaking up if the person is not given the comfort that what he or she says is going to go in to helping the system, but be anonymous as far as who's provided the information. So effectively, what one should do is, slice an organization, or for that matter, any department, at 3 levels. You have the top managers, you have the managers, you have the frontline staff, and then through a process of consultation, through them, engaging them in conversations, you weave the information for a gap analysis and activity from there. Now, just as an example, for example, in the previous slide we had mentioned involvement and empowerment. So factors that could be asked to top management could be things like, whether they can describe consultation arrangements they have in place to encourage people to take part in decision making at both an individual and a representative level. Managers can then describe how they promote a sense of ownership and responsibility, say by encouraging people to be involved in decision making, both individually and through representative groups where they exist. And the frontliners, they can describe how they are encouraged to be involved in decision making that affects the performance of individual teams and the organization at a level that is, of course, appropriate for that level. Now, when these levels are not mixed and they've done, they've catered to separately, information comes in which will tell you whether what is being planned and what is happening is congruent or not. And if not, where the gaps arise, and that would be the basis for the gap analysis. And of course, one critical factor here is that these kind of gap analysis is almost impossible to do by someone within the system, because, as mentioned there, a dispassionate third-party view cannot be brought in. Now, this is about the gap analysis, but then what? What needs to be done? A little bit on the operationalization is looked into here. Well, as I mentioned, there seems to be a phone ringing quite wildly behind there. But as I mentioned, the first thing to be done, of course, is get senior level commitment on that, what the plan of the business is and the goals and ambitions, and if at all, whether there could be any focus areas as far as taking this framework forward. The next step, as I mentioned, and which I've mentioned in detail to you, is the gap analysis, which would automatically throw up the activity planning that needs to be done for the organization. Now, that activity planning automatically should roll up to the organization, and they should have an implementation window. Now, this window would always needs to be at the client's own discretion and cannot be ordained to be completed within a certain X number of days, because the client themselves would have their own priorities at hand. But however, when the client has effected it, and it is critical that they call the third party back for an assessment. This is again just to check from a, so to speak, auditor's perspective, whether what they have done have actually gone in the direction as what needed to be effected. Of course, the fallout could be that the organization might have a few more things to get and reach that benchmark that has been laid across for them, or better still, if they've achieved it, they should be able to be in a position to climb that standard with time. And whichever standard, or accreditation that they get because of this will be the, hallmark for being able to sustain that degree of quality human capital management and development. And for that matter, should have a certain expiry date, because we all know that organizations go through, phenomenal amount of changes with time. Now, some of the tenets as far as this standard is concerned is it needs to be definitely people-centric. Now, when it's people-centric, it obviously is agnostic to the industry and the company. It cannot be a difficult thing to implement, which has huge amount of reading and manuals which go along with it. In today's world, it becomes very difficult to partake in that, and the steps followed should be easy to follow through. However, having said that, simplicity doesn't mean that it should not be powerful. It should be a value-driven thing and not cosmetic. Behavioral changes should be effected within the organization, and it should not lie somewhere as just tick marks of a certain exercise which has been effected. And another factor is, while if the client engages to get along with the standard, one can understand the client has invested in it. How and when the client gets along in completing this framework should be at the client, and he should not be pressurized, because in today's world there are 5,000 other priorities lying on each desk. But that would not take away the responsibility of the third party to engage with the client and interact and show and help him or the organization to achieve the benchmark standard which the client is looking at deriving. Well, the way the holistic approach actually unfolds itself is this. If you remember, we've actually looked